People are always asking me, hey Thought Slime, where do you come up with such creative ideas for videos? Aren't you afraid you're going to run out of ideas? And then you'll have to scrape the bottom of the barrel? Like a Watch Mojo top 10 list type of bullshit? Anyway, today we're going to talk about the top 10 misconceptions about anarchism and anarchists. All jokes aside, a more accurate title for this video might be 10 Things Thought Slime is Sick of Explaining to People. Who are anarchists? What do they want? Don't you worry your pretty little head about it. I've got a whole playlist of that. You can see it in the description.
Just want chaos.
Oh boy, no we don't. We might find chaos preferable to the current order. We may find chaos to be a useful tool in fighting back against that order, but it's a means to an end, not an end in itself. What anarchists want, generally, is a world without coercive domination. A world where nobody has unjustified or unnecessary power over anyone else. Anarchists would argue that such a world is actually less chaotic than our current one. Your day wouldn't be disrupted by, say, the police murdering you with impunity, or losing your job and being forced out onto the street, or by a religious institution being able to impose limits on your consensual sex life, or being forced to do all of the domestic work in your household because you happen to be born a girl. The power relations of our current society are dictated by the powerful having the ability to do violence and the powerless not. That means that you follow the dictates of whoever happens to already be the most powerful. And that's pretty chaotic, because who is powerful is always subject to change. The laws can change without your consent. The financial institutions in charge of your money can wipe out your savings with a few keystrokes. And at all times, you are subject to the constant threat of random violence from anyone who happens to be above you on the power hierarchy. To give you back control over your life strikes me as orderly. A common catchphrase among anarchists is that anarchy is order. To quote Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the guy who coined the term anarchist as a political ideology, as man seeks justice and equality, so society seeks order in anarchy. The idea that we want chaos is just a convenient propaganda tool for the powerful. Their rule is the only thing standing between you and complete ruin. It's an attempt to justify the power they hold over you, by insinuating that without it, things would be even worse. The fact of the matter is, anarchists don't want some lawless hellscape where the strong rule over the weak. We believe we're already living in such a hellscape, and we're trying to get things back on track by putting power into the hands of people, not just a select few people.
Anarchists are violent.
Look, straight up, you will very seldom meet an anarchist who categorically rejects the need for political violence. There are some out there, but their position is by far the minority. The thing is, in order to have any sort of political position, that means deciding where violence is and is not acceptable. Politics is just the application of power, so all violence is political. And you may think you're against all political violence of any kind, but you're probably not. Do you believe that there ought to be police, borders, prisons, private security guards? They all require systemic violence to operate. All of that violence is political. If you would argue that they are necessary, you're justifying types of violence that anarchists are morally opposed to. In that instance, you would be the greater advocate of violence than we are. Anarchists believe violence is acceptable in one and only one scenario: keeping people safe from greater violence. To use violence in any other scenario would represent the very sort of coercive authority anarchists want to eliminate. We just take a broader view of safety than most people would. We believe, for example, that poverty is violence. Poverty is a physical condition imposed on you with the threat of force that causes real material damage, maybe even resulting in death, to the poor. Think about it. If you're starving to death, what stops you from hopping into the grocery store and eating like the enormous bounty of food contained therein? The fact that the police would fucking shoot you, or at best arrest you, which is still violent. That is the routine daily violence we've all come to accept as normal. Anarchists view resistance to that violence as an act of self-defense or community defense. Passively accepting the violence of poverty or bigotry or oppression of any kind is not peaceful, just like it wouldn't be peaceful to walk on by as someone was getting beaten up. To quote Errico Malatesta, If you say that you reject violence when it exceeds the limits imposed by the needs of defense, they accuse you of pacifism, without understanding that violence is the whole essence of authoritarianism, just as the repudiation of violence is the whole essence of anarchism.
Anarchists are liberal.
There is no word more distorted from its actual meaning in the popular political lexicon than liberal. Virtually every political orientation, aside from some liberals themselves, uses this word to just mean the guys I don't like, the jerks. Ask a right-winger what a liberal is, and they'll say anyone to the left of them, everyone from Obama to Joseph Stalin. Ask a leftist, they'll tell you anyone to the right of them until you hit fascism. They'll also throw in anyone they view as ineffective, wishy-washy, or wrong about literally anything, or just people they don't like. Ask a centrist, and they'll say, I don't know, whoever they agree with at the moment. That's what a liberal is. Centrists are useless. The question of what is a liberal is confusing because the way the word is used in North America is very different from what it historically has always meant. A political ideology based around liberty, as they see it, equality under the law, representative democracy, and capitalist free markets. Now, two of those things should jump right out at you as things anarchists don't like. We don't believe in representative democracy, opting instead for direct or consensus democracy, meaning we don't elect someone to govern on our behalf, we govern ourselves. There's a lot of disagreements on how exactly we would do that. Direct democracy and consensus democracy are both schools of thought. They're not synonymous terms, and there are certainly other views. We certainly don't believe in capitalism, and yes, I'm getting to it.
Class struggle.
A lot of Marxists, particularly some Marxist-Leninists, think that anarchists aren't really socialists because we allegedly don't believe in liberating the working class. They think we just wholesale reject class struggle in favor of individualized freedoms. Straight up, that's just horseshit. It's made up. You can't honestly engage with anarchist writings and come away with that conclusion. To quote Proudhon, power, instrument of the collective force created in society to serve as mediator between capital and labor, has become inescapably enchained to capital and directed against the proletariat. To quote Bakunin, so long as human society continues to be divided into different classes as a result of the hereditary inequality of occupations, of wealth, of education, and of rights, there will always be a class-restricted government and the inevitable exploitation of the majorities by the minorities. To quote Kropotkin, it is futile to speak of liberty as long as economic slavery exists. Speak not of liberty, poverty is slavery is not a vain formula. It has penetrated into the ideas of the great working class masses. It filters through all the present literature. It even carries those along who live on the poverty of others, and takes from them the arrogance with which they formerly asserted their rights to exploitation. To quote Bookchin, when modern industry can provide abundance for all, nothing is more vicious to poor people than a lifetime of poverty. As for individualist freedoms taking precedent over class struggle, to quote Malatesta again, I deny that that kind of individualists can be included among anarchists, despite their liking for calling themselves so. If anarchy means non-government, non-domination, non-oppression by man over man, how can one call himself anarchist without lying to himself and the others when he frankly claims that he would oppress the others for the satisfaction of his ego, without any scruple or limit, other than that drawn by his own strength? It's worth noting, however, that most of the individualist anarchists that Malatesta was critiquing here don't necessarily reject class struggle. They view it as necessary for the emancipation of the individual. To quote Max Stirner, when everyone is to cultivate himself into man, condemning a man to machine-like labor amounts to the same thing as slavery. If a factory worker must tire himself to death 12 hours and more, he is cut off from becoming man. To suggest that anarchists don't support class struggle reveals a profound lack of knowledge on the subject. Literally any introductory anarchist text would dispel this myth immediately, so anyone who believes it, and anyone who says it, has not read a shred of anarchist theory, and is thus probably not worth taking seriously on the subject.
And socialism is an oxymoron.
This one is very frustrating because the people who say it likely don't understand what either of the words they're using mean. So, libertarian has historically always meant a libertarian socialist, anarchism being the most popular form thereof. In the middle of the 20th century, the term was stolen by proponents of laissez-faire capitalism. Essentially, they figured that since they opposed the state, and we opposed the state, basically the same thing, right? In North America, this meaning has been the dominant one ever since. When you hear someone call themselves a libertarian at a party, you avoid them for this reason. When We say libertarian, we just mean stateless. That's all. But how could that be socialism? Socialism means big government, right? The state controls industry. I've seen it in movies. Everyone has big hats and lives under a dictator. I learned it in school. The state controls everything. And I understand where you get that idea. There's a lot of countries which call themselves socialist that sure look like that based on what we see in the media. But when we use the word socialism, we mean the workers owning and controlling industry and the products of industry. We mean the end of commodity production, meaning we want things to be made based on human need rather than profit. We mean workplace democracy and the eradication of wage labor. None of that junk requires a centralized state. In fact, if you ask an anarchist, they tell you the state is actually what stops us from getting that junk. The types of socialists that employ top-down or authoritarian organization actually disagree with anarchists pretty hard. There's a long history of animosity on both sides between them and us. Socialists aren't a hive mind. There's a diverse range of opinions, tactics, and influences.
Is inconsistent because you can't redistribute goods without a centralized state.
Okay, well, this is one I hear a lot from ANCAPs, and there's a lot to unpack with it. Firstly, let's tackle the idea that anarchists or socialists more generally want to redistribute goods. So it's true that if we wanted to take all the goods in a society into a big pool and then allocate equal portions of that pool to each citizen, we'd probably need a state to do that absurd thing, but that's not what we're suggesting because that's ridiculous. The goal of socialism isn't that everyone has an equal amount of things. It's to make certain that everyone has equal access to the things that they need to live, like food, medicine, housing, etc. We don't need to make sure that if one citizen has, like, a guitar, that therefore everyone has an equal amount of guitars. Some people don't need guitars. I can't play guitars. I don't need a guitar. More generally, I think this talking point speaks to the idea that it's difficult to accomplish large tasks without a centralized government setting the rules. And I agree. It is definitely more difficult. But anything worth doing is difficult. Imagine two groups wanting to trade Pokemon cards without a centralized state. One group is very rich, and the other is poor. The poor people suggest a fair trade, where the cards that are traded are of commiserate value. The rich people demand that the poor people hand over all their foil Charizards in exchange for, like, energy cards. I don't know why I went with Pokemon cards as an analogy. No one can relate to this. The poor people will be like, fuck no. Give us a fair deal or we walk. They have to work out a compromise that's beneficial to both parties if they want to proceed. Imagine the same scenario with a centralized state. The rich group would naturally have more power and influence over that state, and use that to pressure it into acting on their behalf. They'd be able to get all of the foil Charizards, and they wouldn't have to pay taxes on them. The latter is certainly easier, in the sense that the trade is smooth, and doesn't take as long, but it's not fair. So, how would far-reaching decisions be made without a centralized state? The most commonly proposed solution is a forum of delegates who are not able to make decisions themselves, but instead represent the choices made by their community. Such delegates would act as liaison between their community and the larger federation of free communities. Such a situation might make decision-making slower, but it's more likely to result in fairer outcomes that represent the will of the people, rather than the whims of the powerful. If any differing groups need to reach a decision quickly, maybe there could be some sort of temporary solution put in place, like arbitration by a neutral outside party. You just use common sense. Such an organization would not be a state as anarchists understand it. A state is a centralized top-down organization that maintains a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, that grants itself the sole power of legislating law that all others must obey. The federation we propose cannot impose a centralized law, and therefore must seek compromise between all parties in any negotiation.
Anarchism is just for young idealists who don't understand the real world.
This is an ad hominem attack. It just tries to dismiss our ideas out of hand by insisting, well, we're going to grow out of them. And that's very frustrating because, like, how do you argue with that? Like, yeah, I might. So might you. So might anyone. I'm 34 years old. I am not young. I don't know what jewel pods are. No one will tell me. Sure, you can argue that I don't understand the real world, whatever that is, but, like, I pay my bills, I do my taxes, and I came to anarchism in my 30s. I spent most of my life as a reasonable liberal or social democrat or whatever. I would argue that I outgrew that. Noam Chomsky has a pretty solid grasp on the realities of the world, though I may not always agree with his conclusions. He's 90 years old. He's old as shit. He's also a self-identified anarcho-syndicalist. Most anarchist writers are very, very old, so unbelievably old. I think a lot of this criticism boils down to the idea that anarchism is utopian, which it is in the sense that it intends to create a utopia, but not in the sense that we believe will actually accomplish that. Anarchism isn't a set of rules to be followed, it's a method of analysis. It's not just a system we can set up and then forget about. Anarchy is never done. There's always more injustice to eliminate. There's always inequality to be addressed. We try to make society better, like everyone does, but that doesn't mean we think we can actually make a perfect society. When we call a society or hypothetical society anarchist, we don't mean that it has achieved perfect anarchy or that even that it will. We mean that it's organized around anarchist principles, namely that it's a stateless society organized horizontally.
Anarchism has never been tried.
Yeah, it has. There's been plenty of anarchist societies, though not all of them would necessarily call themselves anarchists. The most famous examples include Revolutionary Catalonia from 1936 to 1939. Anarcho-syndicalists held a territory with a population of 8 million people. And despite a bitter war against fascist incursion, control over production was given directly to the workers, resulting in a doubling of industrial productivity and a 30 to 50% increase in food production. The Free Territory of the Ukraine from 1918 to 1921, where anarchists held a territory with a population of 7 million and organized it into a stateless federation of free communes. The Zapatista Army of National Liberation, which has controlled a large area in Chiapas, Mexico since 1994. The Zapatistas would balk at being referred to as anarchists, but most anarchists support them anyway because, they're a stateless society with participatory democratic decision-making, and that owns bones. Also, it's worth noting that a bunch of North American indigenous nations operated on anarchist principles. Anyway, then us whitos came over and ruined it for everybody, and then we pretended like we invented it. Once again, this is not to say that any of these societies achieved perfect anarchy. None of them eliminated all inequality. That's probably impossible. But they all demonstrate that anarchism can work even across huge areas or over long stretches of time. Most anarchist societies don't end because they fail economically. They end because somebody crushes them.
Is a white or male movement.
White men definitely get the most attention in the anarchist movement. No doubt about that. Historically, we've also failed minorities and women in pretty much every conceivable way. And when I say we here, I mean white anarchists, not necessarily you in particular. I'm not lumping you in with me. Bakunin and Proudhon, for example, were famously anti-Semitic, but when it came time for me to quote a bunch of anarchist philosophers in an earlier entry on this same list, I still thought of them before I thought of, Kim Choi-jin or Virginia Bolton. And that sucks. This is a movement dedicated to the eradication of unjust hierarchy that itself perpetuates an unjust hierarchy, consciously or otherwise, within its own ranks. That being said, there is a rich and storied history of anarchists of all kinds. I mentioned a few in the previous section, but there's also a long tradition of Korean anarchism, Black anarchism, Latin American anarchism. I got this book on Latin American anarchism. Just look how long that is. I had to stop reading it because there's literally too much Latin American anarchist history for me to process. There are anarchists everywhere on this godforsaken earth. As for women, you have figures like Emma Goldman, Lucy Parsons, Voltairine de Cleyre, and even sort of Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, but also she was a eugenicist, so kind of a mixed bag on that one. The fact of the matter is, anarchists were inexorably tied to the early women's movement. Mary Wollstonecraft, an early feminist philosopher, was even married to William Godwin, the man usually cited as the intellectual forebearer to modern anarchism. So does that history absolve anarchists of sexism and racism? Obviously not. But to treat the entire movement as though it's the domain of white men erases centuries of hard work, fighting, and writing by women and people of color and women who were people of color within the movement. It should go without saying that literally any intellectually consistent anarchist would by definition be a feminist and an anti-racist. Not to say we always act like it.
Anarchism can be capitalist.
What? No, it can't. That doesn't make any sense. Who put this on the list? Is this a joke? Those words don't make any sense together. It's like saying bees can be foxes. The fuck are you talking about? Anyway, I already did a whole fucking video about this. Go watch that. Hey, I hope you like this video that I did. I'm recording this in advance, so I don't know if I've done all the patron drawings for June, but I'm trying to. It has been a very busy week for me. I've had a lot of things to do, and kind of let that slide a little. This time it's not because of Mario Maker 2, it's because I'm planning a camping trip, and that required a lot more of my focus than I thought it would. Also, if I'm being honest, there were some mental health concerns this week. I'm fine now. Don't worry about your old pal Thought Slime. But I had a bit of a rough patch there. That happens to people. Don't forget to subscribe to the video and like my channel. Hey, have you ever been to patreon.com/thoughtslime? They got all sorts of knickknacks and paddywhacks over there. All sorts of jolly japes. And also you can give me money so that I can keep making videos. Hey, also, I am sorry that I made fun of the name Owen in the past video. I did not realize that that was just the Irish spelling of Owen. Obviously, I did not mean to pick on Irish people. I meant to pick on J.R.R. Tolkien, but it was insensitive of me. I see that. I'm sorry. I will find more culturally sensitive ways to mock J.R.R. Tolkien. That is my vow to you.